May 5, 1945. Austria. The war in Europe has less than 72 hours left. The Führer is dead in his Berlin bunker. The once invincible Wehrmacht is surrendering en masse to the advancing Allies. The collapse is total. Yet, high in the Tyrolean Alps, where the air is thin and the past feels closer, a medieval fortress known as Schloss Itter stands sentinel on a wooded hill. Inside its thick stone walls, the most improbable, paradoxical, and forgotten scene of the entire Second World War is unfolding. If you had been there, binoculars pressed to your eyes, you would have struggled to believe the evidence before you. On the castle's parapets and at its arrow-slit windows, you would see United States Army soldiers in olive drab, firing their M1 Garands and Browning automatic rifles. But standing shoulder to shoulder with them, in the faded Feldgrau of the German army, are other soldiers, not prisoners, not captives. They are fully armed, wearing their Stahl helms, and they are firing their Mauser rifles and MG-34 machine guns with desperate intensity. And they are aiming at other Germans. Leading this desperate, patchwork defense are two officers from worlds that had spent 5 years locked in mortal combat, an American tank commander with the swagger of a Hollywood star, and a German major who has seen enough of war and ideology and just wants to go home. They are united against a common, fanatical enemy, the Waffen-SS. A battle-hardened, ideologically zealot division is ascending the hill, hell-bent on slaughtering every soul within the castle walls. The Americans and the Germans have one disabled tank, a dwindling supply of ammunition, and a mission to protect the most illustrious group of prisoners of the entire conflict, former prime ministers and generals of France. This is not a cinematic fantasy or an alternate history novel. This happened. It is the only verified instance in the entire war where American and German regular forces fought side by side as allies. This is the full, astonishing story of the battle for Castle Itter, the day sworn enemies became battlefield brothers, the day a burned-out Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny held the line, and the day the very meaning of honor, duty, and humanity was tested in the shadow of the Third Reich's collapse. Part 1, The Gilded Cage of Schloss Itter. To comprehend the sheer insanity of the battle, one must first understand the significance of the castle and its inhabitants. Schloss Itter was no ordinary POW camp. It was, in the chillingly efficient jargon of the Nazis, a Sonderhaftung, a special prisoner facility. It was a gilded cage, a luxurious prison designed to hold high-value hostages for potential political leverage. The castle, with its stunning alpine views, was furnished with relative comfort. The prisoners dined on decent food, slept in proper beds, and even had a library. But the locks were firm, and the guards were SS. The roster inside read like a who's who of French political and military life, albeit from a pre-Vichy era, now bitterly divided amongst themselves. Édouard Daladier, the former Prime Minister of France who had declared war on Germany in 1939. Paul Reynaud, Daladier's successor as Prime Minister, who had led France during the catastrophic invasion of 1940. General Maxime Weygand, the revered, if controversial, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army in 1940. Maurice Gamelin, the French Generalissimo at the war's outset. Michel Clemenceau, son of the legendary World War I Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. Jean Barotra, the famed, bounding Basque, an international tennis star and former Wimbledon champion. François de la Roque, leader of the right-wing Croix de Feu movement. Marie-Agnes de Gaulle, the elder sister of General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French. They were men, and one woman, who had shaped France's destiny, now united only in their captivity and their mutual disdain, for the Germans, for the Vichy collaborators, and often, for each other. They bickered over politics, over past failures, over the future of their nation, all under the watchful, contemptuous eyes of their SS jailers. By early May 1945, the atmosphere in the castle shifted from tense stagnation to acute peril. The guards, men of the SS Totenkopfverband, Death's Head units, were no longer just jailers, they were men staring at the gallows. They knew the war was lost. They also knew the orders from SS Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler were unequivocal, high-value prisoners were to be executed rather than allowed to be liberated. The castle's commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer Sebastian Wimmer, faced a brutal calculus. Surrender to the Americans meant certain arrest and likely prosecution for war crimes. But carrying out Himmler's orders was a final, damning act of barbarism. On May 4, as the distant rumble of American artillery grew louder, Wimmer made his choice. He and most of his SS guards abandoned their posts and fled into the surrounding forests. The French prisoners were, technically, free. But their freedom was a terrifying illusion. Schloss Itter was now an island in a sea of chaos. The surrounding woods and valleys were crawling with the remnants of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen. These were not men ready to surrender. They were fanatical Nazis, many of them foreign volunteers with nowhere to retreat to, who were executing German soldiers for desertion and civilians for perceived disloyalty. For the elderly French statesman and the tennis star, walking out the front gate was a death sentence. The prisoners, led by the more militarily experienced Wehrmacht and the fiercely resilient Barotra, armed themselves with discarded rifles and pistols left by the fleeing guards. But they were a handful of aging politicians and one athlete against a division of hardened SS killers. They needed an army. And in a twist of fate that defied all logic, they would find 1 in 2 men from opposite sides of the globe. The unlikely alliance. A few miles away, in the picturesque town of Gangl, Major Josef, Sepp, Gangl was a man caught between his duty, his conscience, and the looming specter of annihilation. Gangl was a decorated officer of the Wehrmacht, a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front where he had earned a reputation for bravery. But he was no Nazi. He was a soldier who believed in the honor of the German army, an honor he saw being dragged through the mud by the SS. Secretly, he had been in contact with the local Austrian resistance, the Österreichische Freiheitsbewegung. Gangl's immediate concern was his men and the town's civilians. He knew the fanatical SS units in the area planned to destroy Wurgel's bridges and fight to the last man, a pointless act of defiance that would get countless innocents killed. His goal was simple: surrender his unit intact to the Americans and prevent needless bloodshed. He had already raised the white flag over the town hall. But then, a messenger arrived, piercing his fragile plans. The messenger was a Czech cook from Schloss Itter named Andreas Krobot. He had slipped through the SS cordon on a bicycle, carrying a desperate plea from the French prisoners. He found Gangl and delivered the news. The SS had fled, the VIPs were unprotected, and a force of SS was preparing to storm the castle to carry out Himmler's extermination order. Major Gangl faced a profound moral crisis. His duty, in the strictest sense, was to his own men and to surrendering. Engaging in a battle against the SS was tantamount to suicide and could doom the very people he sought to protect. Yet, to stand by while the SS massacred some of Europe's most prominent figures? That, to a man like Gangl, was a stain on the last shred of Germany's military honor that he was desperately trying to preserve. He knew he couldn't fight the SS alone. His small group of weary, under-equipped soldiers would be wiped out. So, Joseph Gangl made a decision of breathtaking audacity. He took a white flag, climbed into his Kübelwagen jeep, and with a couple of his men, drove not away from the fighting, but directly toward it, toward the American lines. He wasn't going to fight. He was going to negotiate. He was going to find an ally. Meanwhile, in the town of Kufstein, elements of the U.S. 12th Armored Division, the Hellcats, were pushing east. Leading a reconnaissance team from the 23rd Tank Battalion was Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr. Lee, 28 years old, was the archetype of the American tank commander, confident, cigar-chomping, resourceful, and possessed of a casual bravery that inspired his men. He was from New York, a man who looked like he'd walked off a movie set to command a Sherman tank he'd affectionately named Besotten Jenny. As Lee's men secured the area, an unbelievable sight approached, a German vehicle flying a white flag. Weapons were raised, fingers hovered near triggers. But the German officer who emerged did not reach for his pistol. He saluted. Through a combination of broken English and gesture, Major Joseph Gangl explained the impossible situation at Schloss Itter to Captain Jack Lee. Lee listened, his mind racing. A German officer, surrendering, but asking for help to fight other Germans? It had all the hallmarks of an elaborate trap. Yet, something in Gangl's earnest desperation, in the sheer specificity of the story, rang true. Lee was a soldier with initiative, a man unafraid of unorthodox action. He chewed his cigar, looked at the map, and made a call that would become legend. "All right, Fritz," he is reported to have said. "Let's go get M." Lee radioed his superior, Lieutenant Colonel Robert O'Brien. The conversation was undoubtedly tense. Lee requested permission to lead a rescue mission with a German officer as his guide. The response from higher command was likely a mixture of disbelief and apprehension, but in the fluid chaos of the war's final days, Lee was given the green light. He assembled a tiny force, his own Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, one other light tank, and a squad of just 14 infantrymen. Gangl returned with his Kübelwagen and a truck carrying about 10 of his most loyal German soldiers. Thus, the most improbable Allied column of World War II formed up, an American Sherman tank in the lead, followed by American GIs in jeeps, trailed by a German truck full of German soldiers, all rolling together into the heart of SS-controlled territory. It was a surreal snapshot of a world turned upside down. The fortress under siege. The journey to Schloss Itter was a battle in itself. The winding mountain roads were dotted with SS checkpoints and patrols. Besotten Jenny's 76mm gun spoke first, blasting apart roadblocks. Gangl's men, now fighting for their lives against their former comrades, added their fire from the truck. This was no ruse, the Germans were engaged in full-scale combat against the SS, proving their commitment with every bullet fired. They reached the castle gates in the late afternoon of May 4th. The French prisoners, hearing the American engine and the gunfire, rushed out in hope of liberation. Their expectant faces fell as they saw the reality, not columns of infantry and tanks, but a single, dust-covered Sherman and a handful of men. "Where is the rest of the army?" one of them asked, perhaps Reynaud or Daladier. Captain Lee, climbing out of his tank turret with characteristic bravado, grinned. "I'm it." Without hesitation, Lee took command of the castle. A mere captain began issuing orders to former prime ministers and four-star generals as if they were recruits. He herded them back inside to relative safety. He positioned Besotten Jenny at the main gate, its gun covering the sole approach road. He deployed his American GIs in the medieval towers for elevation and fields of fire. And he turned to Major Gangl and gave him a sector of the wall to defend with his men. The German major saluted and set about organizing his soldiers. For the first time since 1941, German soldiers were taking orders from an American officer, and both were perfectly comfortable with it. That night, within the cold stone walls, a fragile camaraderie was born. American K-rations and German Zwieback were shared. Cigarettes, Lucky Strikes and German Juniors were exchanged. Soldiers who days before would have shot each other on sight now checked each other's ammunition, pointed out fields of fire, and shared stories in broken phrases and hand gestures. They all understood the arithmetic of their situation. They were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. When dawn broke, they would likely be fighting to the death, together, the battle of the last stand. May 5, 1945. The morning fog burned away to reveal a perfect, sunny alpine day. The serenity was shattered by the crack of the first sniper rifle. The SS had arrived in force, over 150 troops of the 17th SS, supported by heavy machine guns, mortars, and, most ominously, at least one 88mm flak gun, the legendary weapon that had terrorized Allied tanks from Africa to Normandy. The battle was joined. The SS, seeing German uniforms on the battlements firing at them, flew into a rage. To them, Gangl and his men were the worst kind of traitors. Verräter. The assault was furious and focused. Machine gun fire chipped away at the ancient stone. Mortar rounds exploded in the courtyard. The French prisoners, to their immense credit, refused to be mere spectators. Despite Lee's orders, Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier, men in their 60s, took up positions at windows with rifles. Even the tennis star, Jean Barotra, armed himself and moved between positions, delivering ammunition and encouragement. The centerpiece of the defense was Besotten Jenny, parked stoically at the gate. The SS knew it was the linchpin. They maneuvered their 88mm gun into position. A shot rang out, the iconic sound of German artillery. The shell struck true. Besotten Jenny erupted in flames. The American crew, including Captain Lee, bailed out just seconds before the tank was fully engulfed. Their only heavy armor and most powerful weapon was now a burning hulk, blocking the very gate it was meant to protect. The situation was dire. The defenders were now down to small arms. Ammunition was critically low. The SS, sensing victory, began to press inward, using the cover of the surrounding woods to creep closer to the walls. It was during this intense pressure that a moment of transcendent heroism occurred. Major Josef Gangl, moving along the ramparts to direct fire, saw former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud standing exposed at a window, firing his rifle. A German sniper had the Frenchman in his sights. Gangl shouted a warning and lunged forward, pushing Reynaud out of the line of fire. In that instant, a sniper's bullet meant for Reynaud struck Josef Gangl in the chest. The German major, who had fought for years on the Eastern Front, died on a castle wall in Austria, killed by a fellow German while saving the life of a French politician he had been ordered to guard. He was the only defender to die at Castle Itter. His death cast a pall over the defenders but also steeled their resolve. The fight was now personal. Yet, the tactical reality was grim. By noon, they were nearly out of bullets. The SS was preparing for a final, crushing assault to overwhelm the gate. Captain Lee, his face smudged with soot, prepared his men for a last stand in the courtyard with bayonets and gun butts. Hope was fading. Then, Jean Barotra made an outrageous proposal. The former tennis champion, known for his speed and agility, volunteered to run through the SS lines to find help. "I am fast. I can do it," he insisted. Before Lee could formally agree, Barotra vaulted over a low section of the castle wall, hit the ground running, and disappeared into the tree line. SS bullets kicked up dirt around his heels, but he weaved and dodged like he was on the courts of Wimbledon, vanishing into the forest. He ran for miles, his heart pounding, until he found a column from the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division cautiously advancing up the valley. Breathless and disheveled, the tennis star gasped out his message, "The castle, they are dying. You must hurry. Relief and legacy." Back at Schloss Itter, the SS launched their final push. They had reached the main gate and were preparing to breach it. Captain Lee and his men, American and German alike, shared a last look, ready to sell their lives dearly. Then, a new sound echoed through the valley, not the sharp report of German small arms, but the deep, throaty roar of multiple Sherman tank engines and the sustained fire of an entire American infantry company. The relief force from the 142nd Infantry had arrived at a dead run. They smashed into the SS flank with overwhelming force. Machine guns chattered, tanks fired high-explosive shells into the woods. The SS troops, caught between the castle and a fresh, battalion-sized American force, broke and scattered into the mountains. The siege was over. American soldiers poured into the courtyard. They found a scene of exhaustion, smoke, and surreal unity. GIs and Wehrmacht soldiers sat side by side, sharing canteens. Captain Jack Lee, the picture of weary defiance, approached the commander of the relief column. He took the stub of a cigar from his mouth and, with impeccable timing, asked, "What took you so long?" The French VIPs were escorted out, liberated for the second time, now by a proper American force. They were driven to safety, their lives and their futures preserved by the most unlikely coalition imaginable. In the days that followed, the war officially ended. The story of Castle Itter was briefly celebrated, a strange, happy footnote in the vast, grim narrative of World War II. Captain John Jack Lee Jr. was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his extraordinary heroism. He returned home to New York, bought a hotel, and rarely spoke of the battle. He died in 1973. Major Josef Gangl was buried with honor in the cemetery at Wehrmacht. In Austria today, he is remembered as a hero, a German soldier who chose humanity over fanaticism. A street is named after him. He represents the other Germany, the men who wore the uniform but refused to surrender their conscience. The battle for Castle Itter was a small, almost quaint engagement in the context of a war that saw Stalingrad, Normandy, and the Holocaust. No grand strategic outcome hinged on it. Yet, its symbolic power is immense. It stands as a flaming testament to a profound truth, that even in the absolute depths of history's most cataclysmic conflict, individual courage and common humanity could erupt through the cracks. It proved that enemies are not always immutable concepts, that honor can cross battle lines, and that in the face of true evil, former adversaries can find themselves on the same side, back to back, fighting for something simply good. Years later, when asked about Itter, Jack Lee would simply shake his head and smile. "It was the damnedest thing I ever saw," he'd say. "Me and the Krauts, fighting side by side. It remains, and will likely forever remain, the only time the United States Army and the German Wehrmacht fought formally as allies." Major Gangl died saving a French politician from a Nazi sniper. In his final moment, he was not a German soldier or an American ally. He was simply a man doing the right thing. Was he a traitor to the crumbling Reich, or a hero to a future Europe at peace? The answer, perhaps, is what makes his story, and the story of Castle Itter, endure as a beacon of light in a very dark time.